right, let's go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 20. And we're going to continue on the unsung heroes and obscure villains in the Bible. And last week, 2 weeks ago, we started with Abiathar. He was a spy for David. He was a priest and ambassador and ended up being a conspirator against Solomon. And then we looked at Abimelech last week, who was the first king of Israel, one of the sons of Gideon, who convinced the men of Shechem to make him king over them, and then he convinced the rest of the nation to make him king over the whole nation, and then he turned against the men of Shechem, or they turned against him, and there's a big conflict, and he eventually died from a woman throwing a stone off the wall down onto his head. So that was the first two. Now we're going to look at another Abimelech in Genesis chapter 20. And this Abimelech is not an Israelite. He is the king of Gerar. So let's look at verse number 1 and 2 here. And Abraham journeyed from thence toward the south country and dwelled between Kadesh and Shur and sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, "She is my sister." And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. Okay, so they're very familiar passage here. So this is a passage that actually is taught often in Sunday school classes, unlike the previous two that we looked at. But it's always taught from the perspective of Abraham and Sarah. And there's very little focus on this guy named Abimelech. He just happens to be a side character in the Sunday school lessons. And so we want to look at Abimelech today and see his position in all this and see what we can learn about him. Come on in. See what we can learn about him from this passage. We are in Genesis chapter 20. We're going through a series on unsung heroes and obscure villains in the Bible. And so it's the little guys that you don't hear about very often in Sunday school classes. So today we're looking at Abimelech, the king of Gerar. And we just read verses 1 and 2 of chapter 20. And Abraham journeyed from thence toward the south and dwelt between Kadesh and Shur and sojourned in Gerar. So he's traveling through this land. And when he gets into this land of Gerar, verse 2, and Abraham said of Sarah his wife, "She is my sister." So he's telling everyone, this is my sister, not my wife. And the king there, Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. So he said, okay, she's not your wife. I want her to be my wife. It's interesting here to keep in mind that Sarah at this point is about 90 years old. So now at this time period, men are living a lot longer too. Abraham lived a very long life. Sarah lived a very long life. This is about the same time period as Job, and Job was 140 years after his trial. So after his kids were all adults and all of them died, and he had this whole trial where he lost everything, and then he had more sons and daughters and lived an additional 140 years after that. So this is still the time period where men are living a long, long time. And so Sarah is apparently very beautiful. And Abraham says she's my sister because he don't want to get killed, have his wife stolen from him. And so he just has his wife stolen from him and not get killed. All right, so that's the situation that we're in here. We're looking at Abimelech and his role in all this and seeing the story from his perspective. So he sees a beautiful woman coming into his kingdom, and he inquires and asks, and okay, she's his sister. She's not married. She's not taken. I think I'll take her. And so he makes her his wife. Verse number 3, but God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, behold, thou art but a dead man, for the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife. The first thing that sticks out to me here is God came to Abimelech in a dream instead of Abraham. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So here you have a man, he's not in the godly line. He's not a Jew. He's a Gentile. In fact, we'll find out. You find out in chapter 24. He's actually the king of the Philistines, or a Philistine nation. The nation of Gerar is one of the 5 major kingdoms of the Philistines. And so later the Philistines are the sworn enemies of Israel. That's who David fights when he goes up against Goliath. At this time, though, the Philistines are a godly people. And Abimelech is a godly king among the Philistines. By the way, the fact that the Philistines were godly at this point in time may be one of the reasons that God did not have Israel conquer the Philistines when they conquered the rest of Canaan. He gave the borders of Canaan, and one of the borders he gave was to leave a little section right there along the Mediterranean Sea that was carved out specifically for the Philistines. And he told Israel, do not conquer that area. That belongs to the Philistines. You leave it to them. And it may have been because of the fact that Abimelech and the Philistines were so godly at this time, and that heritage stayed with them, and God continued to bless them all the way down to when the Israelites came back. Now, we don't know that for sure, but it's a reasonable speculation based on the way God treats people that serve him. And so here we have Abimelech. He's a godly man that God comes to and warns him, this woman you've taken is a man's wife. Verse 4, but Abimelech had not come near her, and he said, Lord. And he addresses God as Lord. He doesn't say, who are you? So he has this relationship with God. This is not strange to him that God is appearing to him in a dream. This is normal, and he just has a conversation with God like he would normally do. Lord, wilt thou also slay a righteous nation? And so he says, we're righteous. Why are you going to destroy us for this thing? Verse 5, said he not unto me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and innocency of my hands have I done this. And so he pleads his cause and says, if I had known, I wouldn't have done this. I'm innocent in all this. And God said unto him in a dream, yea, I know that thou didst this in the integrity of thy heart, for I also withheld thee from sinning against me, therefore suffered I thee not to touch her. And so God cared enough about Abimelech that he actually prevented Abimelech from going in unto Sarah and consummating the marriage. And we don't know how he did it. There's all kinds of ways. The Calvinists like to take this passage and say God controlled Abimelech's thoughts and desires and wouldn't let him do anything, controlled his will. There's lots of other ways. I mean, he's the king of a nation. There's all kinds of things that can come up to take away his time and prevent him from going in unto Sarah. And so God did that. God interfered and made sure that Abimelech stayed righteous and that he wouldn't unknowingly commit this sin. And then God continues speaking to him. Now therefore restore the man his wife, for he is a prophet, and he shall pray for thee, and thou shalt live. And if thou restore her not, know thou that thou shalt surely die, thou and all that are thine. And then verse number 8, Abimelech obeys. Therefore Abimelech rose early in the morning, and called all his servants, and told all the things in their ears, and the men were sore afraid. And Abimelech called Abraham, and said unto him, what hast thou done unto us? And what have I offended thee, that thou hast brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? Thou hast done deeds unto me that ought not to be done. And so he's rebuking Abraham quite severely here. Verse number 10, Abimelech said unto Abraham, what sawest thou that thou hast done this thing? Why did you do this, Abraham? This is crazy. This is stupid. Why would you do such a thing? And in verse number 11, Abraham explains, and Abraham said, because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. And yet indeed she is my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. Okay, so he explains, I was afraid. I thought the fear of God is not in this place. And that's a very common error that we make. We look at people that are culturally different, and we think because their culture is different, then they must be different spiritually as well. They must not be brothers in Christ because they have a different culture and they do things a little bit differently than we do. If we're not careful, that's a problem that churches can have. So we think this church is of a different denomination, therefore they don't love God, they don't fear God. Or this church is, sometimes it's even to where, yes, they're a Baptist church and they believe everything we do theologically, but they teach differently in this one thing. Maybe they're preterists. We were talking about preterism the other day, and they believe that all the things in Revelation have already come to pass, and we believe it's all in the future and going to be in the future. Therefore, they're heretics, and they can't be Christians, and we got to destroy them and talk bad about them and try and ruin their ministry. That's not the way that we should be doing things. That was Abraham's problem here. He looked at cultural differences, and he said, because they're a little different from me, there's no fear of God in this place. And so therefore that caused him to lie or tell a half-truth, which is a lie, and say that Sarah was just his sister, and it could have brought destruction on an entire nation because he believed just because they were different that they didn't have any fear of God.
This also shows you that your sin can affect others.
Right.
Abraham's sin affected Abimelech, which if he had sinned, it would have affected the whole nation.
Right.
People oftentimes say, well, my sin only affects me, and that's can't be further from the truth.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, so Abimelech restores Sarah to Abraham, and he gives Abraham sheep and oxen, and Abraham stays there for a while. And he tells Abraham in verse 15, Abimelech said, behold, my land is before thee, dwell where it pleaseth thee. So he invites Abraham, hey, stay. You're a fellow believer in God, just like me. Stay with us, spend time with us. Let's have fellowship with each other instead of being at ends against each other. And then in verse 16, Abimelech gives Sarah some very wise marital advice. And Abimelech said, verse 16, and unto Sarah he said, behold, I have given thy brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Behold, he is to thee a covering of the eyes unto all that are with thee, and with all other. Thus she was reproved. Okay, so he reproves her. He rebukes her, says, what you did was wrong. Now let me teach you a little principle about marriage that you need to understand. And he tells her this. He says, your husband is to thee a covering of the eyes unto all others. A covering of the eyes, that's a veil. That's what he's talking about. Your brother, your husband, is your veil. Now, in that time period, the veil was used, and even today in many cultures, the veil is used to hide the woman's face. And it's not because, like in America, we're very anti-Muslim, and we know that they are wrong. Their religion is wrong. That's correct. They are wrong. If they follow their religion, it's going to lead them to hell, and we need to take the gospel to them. All that's correct. But because of that, we sometimes misunderstand where some of their cultural things come from. And we look at things like the veil that the Muslim women wear to hide their face, and we look at that and say, oh, that's terrible. The men are hiding their women and subjecting them to all these horrors by making them cover up and all that. No, there was a reason for the woman covering her face, and it was to protect her and hide her from men who might desire her for her beauty and make unwanted advances against her. That was the whole purpose of the veil in that old culture, and the Muslims have carried that culture forward into today, but we still have remnants of that in our culture too. That's why when a woman gets married in a traditional European marriage, she has a veil on. And she comes to the altar with the veil, and that's signifying she's not available to the groom yet. And then at the end of the ceremony, when the preacher says you may kiss your bride, the groom lifts the veil, saying, now she's available to me, and now I can have her. Her beauty is no longer hid from me. Her beauty now is available to me. And so,
Available. Get it.
yeah, there you go. No pun intended there. And so when Abimelech is telling Sarah that her husband is like a veil to her, apparently Sarah didn't have this idea of, this tradition of a veil. That wasn't part of her culture. It was probably part of the culture in Gerar, but it wasn't part of the culture for Abraham and Sarah. And so Abimelech is explaining, your husband is your veil. And when people know that you're married, then most men are not going to make advances to you because they know, hey, you're already taken. This is men are wired in a way, and he's explained to her, men are wired in such a way that just the mere knowledge that a woman is married is enough to turn most men away. Now, you still have those idiots that, don't care, and they usually learn their lesson the hard way. And then once they learn their lesson the hard way, then they care, and they won't go after married women. And so he's telling her, just letting men know that your fear was that men would see you and your beauty, and they would kill your husband in order to take you. That's not the way men operate. Men operate by seeing you and your beauty and saying, hey, I wonder if she's married. And then they find out that you're married, and they say, okay, well, I'll go search for someone else. That's the way that men are. They generally will not risk the wrath of the husband by going after a married woman. This is why in our culture, a married woman who wants to be promiscuous will often take off her wedding ring before she goes out to the bars or wherever to pick up guys. She doesn't do that with her wedding ring flashing around everywhere. She's going to take that wedding ring off so that the guys know that she's available. And in fact, we had a woman come into our thrift store a while back, and she bought a wedding ring. It wasn't gold because we don't sell the real gold and stuff in the store, but she bought just a band, and so she bought one with a little cubic zirconium diamond on top. And she bought it and told the cashier, yeah, I need that as a wedding ring. And so the cashier is feeling sorry for her. And so she says, oh, did you lose your wedding ring? She says, well, yeah, but I'm not married. I just wear one of these cheap ones so that I can keep the guys off of me. And she realized exactly what Abimelech was saying, that if you tell the men, if a woman indicates to men that she's married, that's usually enough to keep the guys off of her.
There's actually a girl at where I used to work. She would do the same thing. She was a nurse, and she told me one time, I said, you're not married. Why are you wearing a ring? She said, because some of these patients come in here, and if they don't see a ring, they start hitting on you.
Yep.
She said, so I wear this ring, and nobody bothers me.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you look at Proverbs 6:34, it says there, jealousy is the rage of a man. And that's true. If a man is jealous for his wife, he goes insane. I mean, this is why God had the law of jealousies, where back in Numbers, I think it's Numbers 5 or 35, something like that. Anyway, it's the law of jealousies, where if a man is jealous of his wife but he doesn't have proof, God said, all right, here's the test you do, and you mix this dirt from the temple with the water and make the woman drink it, and if her thigh rots out because she drank that water, then she's been unfaithful. And because a man who's jealous, he just doesn't think straight. And so God said, okay, I'm going to give you a way to test. And when you have no proof whatsoever that she's been unfaithful, but you're still jealous, here, I'm going to give you a way to test it. And so he gives this way to test it, and no one ever had their thigh rot from drinking a little bit of muddy water. I mean, anyone with half a brain could realize this test is not ever going to show that a woman has actually been unfaithful to her husband. But it's just to give these men that had gone insane with their jealousy, give them resolution and say, okay, now you've had the test, you see she's not been unfaithful to you, and then at that point, if he continued to pursue it, he was to be punished by law if he continued to accuse her of being unfaithful. In our court system, the courts actually recognize jealousy as a standard cause of temporary insanity. And there are hundreds of cases of men, jealous husbands, going and killing their wife's lover and getting off because they get off on a temporary insanity plea. Because our courts recognize when a man's jealous, he goes insane. I mean, he's not going to stop at anything. And that's the same thing that Abimelech is kind of pointing out here to Sarah. Men recognize that. Men inherently realize, if I go after another man's wife, he's going to come after me, and there's nothing I can do to stop him. that I will not be able to stop him. One of us is going to die. And so most men will not take that kind of a risk. And so just the woman indicating that she is married, that's the same as her wearing a veil and hiding her beauty from other men. And they turn away and go after easier prey, so to speak. And so that's the advice that Abimelech gave Sarah. And so he's a very godly man, a very wise man. He's doing everything right here. And this guy is someone that we should definitely seek to emulate in our lives. And there's another thing about him in the next chapter, Genesis 21 and verse 22. Now, at this point, Abraham has left Gerar. He's gone back into the land of Canaan. And he's now had, let's see, I think it's Ishmael Isaac. Isaac that was just born. So Ishmael's been born, and then now Isaac has been born. And then in verse number 22 rather. And it came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, the chief captain of his host, spake unto Abraham, saying, God is with thee in all that thou doest. Now therefore swear unto me here by God, that thou wilt not deal falsely with me, nor with my son, nor with my son's son, but according to the kindness that I have done unto thee, thou shalt do unto me, and to the land wherein thou hast sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. And so here we have a covenant that Abimelech makes with Abraham. And remember I mentioned that Abimelech's relationship with God may have been why God didn't allow Israel to conquer the Philistines when they conquered Canaan. Here again is another indicator of that Abimelech makes this covenant with Abraham, and now he only says it to my son and my son's son, but God may have carried that covenant all the way down for many generations, all the way past just the first 2 or 3 generations. And that may again be why God decided not to allow Israel to conquer Philistia at the time that they conquered the rest of Canaan. Now, they did have war with the Philistines later, and they did eventually end up not so much conquering, but controlling Philistia and having power over them. They became tributaries to Israel. I think it was during the time of David, either David or Solomon at some point in there. And so that's Abimelech. Now, when you go to Genesis chapter 26, there is another reference to Abimelech, and I'm not sure if it's the same guy or if it's a different guy. I initially wrote this with saying that this is a different Abimelech, that he's the son of the first Abimelech. But if you remember, this is the time period when men live really long lives. So this may still be the same Abimelech. He may have been very young when Abraham came. And then when Isaac now is grown, this is now at least 55 years later. So at least 55 years after the first reference to Abimelech in Genesis 20, we get Genesis 26 and verse number 1. And there was a famine in the land beside the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went unto Abimelech, king of the Philistines, unto Gerar. And so here we have Isaac going to this guy named Abimelech. And it's very common among kings for, you have George the First, George the Second, George the Third, etc. So it's very common for the name of the king to pass down. So that's a possibility. And that's what I initially thought. But then when you look in verse number 26, then Abimelech went to him from Gerar, and Ahuzath, one of his friends, and Phicol, the chief captain of his army. And if you remember, when Abimelech went to Abraham, it was Abimelech and Phicol, the chief captain of his army. And so here you have 2 names that appear in the same, 2 different places. So it's not as likely that the chief captain of the army passed his name down to his son as it is that a king passed his name down to his son. And it's also not likely that the 2 would both be in the same positions. So I think now that this is actually the same people that had dealings with Abraham. They may have been young when Abraham was there. Now they're on up in age, when Isaac comes. And there's another indicator of that when Isaac does the same thing that Abraham did. When you come down here to verse number 6. And Isaac dwelt in Gerar, and the men of the place asked him of his wife, and he said, She is my sister. For he feared to say, She is my wife, lest, said he, the men of the place should kill me for Rebekah, because she was fair to look upon. And again, Abraham, it was a half-truth. With Isaac, this is a full lie. There's no half-truth at all in this. He is just straight up lying. And it comes to bite him the same way it did. Okay, verse number 8. And it came to pass when he had been there a long time, that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out at a window and saw, and behold, Isaac was sporting with Rebekah his wife. And Abimelech called Isaac and said, Behold, of a surety she is thy wife. And how saidst thou, She is my sister? And Isaac said unto him, Because I said, Lest I die for her. And Abimelech said, What is this thou hast done unto us? One of the people might lightly have lain with thy wife, and thou shouldst have brought guiltiness upon us. And Abimelech charged all his people, saying, He that toucheth this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. Okay, and so it's the same situation, but it's the clue here that shows us this might be the same Abimelech is that he didn't go after Rebekah. Maybe he learned his lesson, he was suspicious. It's also interesting to point out none of the other men went after Rebekah. They may have remembered what happened with Sarah, and they may have been suspicious.
You think, you hear the same scenario, and it's like a deja vu. This sounds way too familiar. I'm just going to wait.
Right.
It's like you say, he's learned his lesson.
Yep. And so again, you have Abimelech rebuking Isaac this time, and when it was Abraham before, saying that you shouldn't have done this. That this is a lie. You should not be doing this. You could have caused us to commit a great sin and bring the wrath of God on us. Now, in this passage, it mentions that Abimelech was a Philistine, and I mentioned that several times. That's where it's mentioned here in verse number 1. Also, if you're familiar with Gerar, you recognize it's a Philistine. And there are actually many, many, many references in Scripture to godly men and nations outside of Israel. Now, they're usually skimmed over, and we don't really pay attention to them, but there's a lot of them. You have Abimelech here. You have Balaam, the prophet that with Balaam's donkey and all that story. He was a prophet of Midian. He was a Midianite who conversed with God. Cornelius in the New Testament was a Gentile, and he had God appear to him in a dream and tell him to go send for Peter and have Peter give him the gospel. Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, was a priest. He was a priest of God, but he was not. He was actually a Midianite, just like Balaam was. He was kin to the Midianites. He was a Kenite, which is similar to the Midianites. They're related. You had Uriah, Uriah the Hittite, the husband of Bathsheba that David had killed. He was one of David's mighty men, and a very godly man. And he was a Hittite. And Hittites were, at one time, the sworn enemies of Israel. You had Jael that killed Sisera by driving a nail through his head. She was the wife of Heber the Kenite. He was a descendant of Moses' father-in-law. And it's all throughout the Bible. You have these Gentile people. Ruth is another example. Rahab, Gentile people who worshipped and served God. Not just people, many times it's even nations that are mentioned that worshipped and served God. And there's a common misconception among Christians that God only spoke to and through the Jews during the Old Testament, but he didn't. He spoke to lots of people. We only have records of his speaking to and through the Jews primarily. But God did a lot more than what is recorded in the Bible. Even at the end of the Gospel of John, John says that the things Jesus did, there are so many of them that if they were all written down, the world could not contain the books that would be written. So even what we have about Jesus in the 4 Gospels, that's just a minuscule, tiny amount of all the things that he did that we don't have record of. So there's a lot of things that God did that we don't know about, And so we can't just conclude because we don't know about it. Therefore, God didn't have any dealings with all these other people. There has always been a witness from God all across the world to every people. You have missionaries that go to places that supposedly have never heard the gospel, and many times they'll come across someone who says, "I've been praying for a missionary to come here." Well, I mean, this is supposed to be people that have never, ever, ever heard of the gospel, and they'll say, "I've been praying." Find some old man that's been there for years and said, "I've been praying that God would send someone to tell us what the truth is." And God had enough of a witness there for that man to start praying and ask for the truth, and then God sent someone to tell him the truth. And God does that, has always done that, and does that even today. Okay, so let's continue with Abimelech. He allowed Isaac to stay with him for many years after rebuking him. Verse number 13, the man, talking about Isaac, the man waxed great and went forward and grew until he became very great, for he had possessions of flocks and possessions of herds and great store of servants, and the Philistines envied him. And then in verse number 16, Abimelech comes to Isaac finally, says, "And Abimelech said unto Isaac, Go from us, for thou art much mightier than we." Here he has a single man, Isaac, who now has become mightier than the entire nation of the Philistines. And they say, "You need to leave. You're becoming a bigger influence in our area than any of the rest of us are. You're the most powerful man here, so powerful that we couldn't stop you if you wanted to take over the entire nation." And so they kicked Isaac out, and he left. And Isaac apparently left in a bit of a huff and didn't really care for that. You can see that in verse number 26 through 31. Then Abimelech went to him from Gerar, and Ahuzath, one of his friends, and Phicol, the chief of his army. And Isaac said unto them, Wherefore come ye to me, seeing ye hate me, and have sent me away from you? So he took this kind of personal and didn't like it. And they said, in verse number 28, We saw certainly that the Lord was with thee, and we said, Let there be now an oath betwixt us, even betwixt us and thee, and let us make a covenant with thee, that thou wilt do us no hurt, as we have not touched thee, and as we have done unto thee nothing but good, and have sent thee away in peace. Thou art now the blessed of the Lord. And he made them a feast, and they did eat and drink, and they rose up betimes in the morning, and sware one to another, and Isaac sent them away, and they departed from him in peace. And so Abimelech wisely recognized Isaac got the wrong idea here. And he's in the intervening verses here, there's some conflict between the Philistines and the servants of Isaac over different wells that they were digging and stuff. And so Abimelech didn't go to war over all this. He said, there's just a little bit of a misunderstanding. Let me go straighten this out. And he went to Isaac and explained the situation. And Isaac is all hot and ready to off with his head type of a reaction. And he had a calm answer. And, the Bible tells us that a soft answer turneth away wrath. And Abimelech came with a soft answer and said, Hey, we didn't mean you anything harm. We just saw that God was blessing you. And we want to be friends and live in peace. We just didn't want you living right next to us because you were too powerful. And so they made up, they had a feast, and everything's better after eating. And so then after eating, they're all full and they can sign this peace treaty. And there is a peace treaty between Isaac and Abimelech and the men of Gerar.
So do you think it was a similar covenant between him
and Abraham?
Yeah, between
Right.
Isaac and...
Yeah, I would think it's the same thing.
That's another thing that would lead you to think that it's the same king, because
Right.
he does the exact same thing at the
Right.
very end there.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, that resolution worked with his dad. It's going to work here too. We can keep this smoothed over.
Yep. So that's Abimelech. A lot we can learn from him. He's a very, very wise and godly man. And it's kind of surprising to me that he's not talked about more because of his wise and godly example that we can learn a lot from. But it may be that he's not talked a whole lot because he's one of the bad guys. He's a Philistine.
Yeah.
We don't talk about Philistines.
I think you bring out a good point, though, that it was obvious that God was blessing them. It was a nation that was prosperous in a lot of ways, and that God did protect them under different circumstances up to the point of, when they were rebelling against God's chosen. Up to this point, even here, they're not trying to fight with him. They're trying to make peace with him, and maybe even by saying, "Okay, I'll marry your sister," he's thinking we can embrace you and bring you in.
That was a common way to bring peace between different people. Marry into the family. Yeah.
Well, one thing that I wondered though was they're sojourning, they're going through the land, and Abimelech says, "Oh wait, I want you as a wife." Wait a minute, they're not planning. Are they planning to stay? Did he think, "Oh, I'll just forcefully take you"? I don't know.
Well, Abraham was there for many years. I think it was 40 years that he was in Gerar. So it was a long time. All right, well, let's go ahead and close with the word of prayer and head on down.